On the morning of August 15, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington stepped out of her family's front door carrying a small Bible. The walk to summer Bible camp was less than a mile. Quiet suburban streets. Familiar neighbors. A church community built on trust. Witnesses would later remember seeing Gretchen walking calmly along the roadside that morning. None of them realized they were looking at the final moments before she vanished forever. Because somewhere along that route, a predator was waiting. Not a stranger. Not a drifter hiding in the shadows. But a respected pastor. A man who would later stand beside grieving parents, join search efforts, comfort the community, while secretly hiding one of Pennsylvania's darkest cold case secrets for nearly 48 years. Until old diary entries, and memories buried for decades, finally surfaced and reopened a case that would divide opinion for years. This is the story of Gretchen Harrington, and the pastor who fooled everyone. In the summer of 1975, Marple Township, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors. Tree-lined neighborhoods stretched across quiet suburban streets. Children rode bikes freely through the community. Families gathered in churches every Sunday. Trust shaped daily life. For the Harrington family, faith sat at the center of everything. Gretchen Harrington was the third of 4 daughters. Friends described her as thoughtful, gentle, and deeply obedient, the kind of child who followed rules carefully and tried hard to make adults proud. Her father, Reverend Gordon Harrington, served as pastor at Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church. The family was deeply respected within the church community. That August, Gretchen had been attending vacation Bible school programs hosted between local churches. On the morning of August 15th, she left home shortly before 9 a.m. carrying her Bible and began walking toward a nearby chapel where Bible camp was being held. It was a familiar route. Less than a mile from home. But Gretchen never arrived. The disappearance shattered Marple Township's sense of safety almost instantly. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search effort. Search dogs moved through dense wooded areas surrounding the township while volunteers formed human chains across nearby fields and creeks. Detectives retraced Gretchen's walking route repeatedly, from her family home along Lawrence Road toward the church where Bible school was being held. Officers knocked on doors asking neighbors whether they had seen anything unusual that morning. A suspicious car. A scream. A stranger. But the timeline kept collapsing into silence. Missing posters carrying Gretchen's school photograph appeared in grocery stores, church windows, and telephone poles across Delaware County. Local newspapers covered the disappearance heavily as fear spread across suburban Pennsylvania. Because this was the 1970s. Children still walked alone to school. Parents trusted their communities. Churches represented safety. And now an 8-year-old girl had vanished in broad daylight. Then, nearly 2 months later, investigators made a devastating discovery. If you enjoy deep true crime documentaries and cold cases like this, subscribe now, because some of the stories we cover are even more disturbing than this one. On October 14, 1975, Gretchen's remains were found inside Ridley Creek State Park. The wooded area was remote and heavily overgrown. For Gretchen's family, hope disappeared instantly. For investigators, the missing person case officially became a homicide investigation. But even after that discovery, the mystery deepened. There were no clear suspects. No witnesses to the abduction. No public breakthrough. And standing among devastated church members during the investigation, was another pastor named David Zandstra. At the time, nobody viewed him as dangerous. He looked like a grieving member of the community trying to help bring a little girl home. But investigators would later allege something far more disturbing about his possible connection to the case, a claim that would only surface years later. David Zandstra did not resemble the image people imagine when they think about killers. That was part of what made the allegation so disturbing. He was a pastor. A husband. A father. A trusted religious leader. Church members remembered him as calm, approachable, and deeply involved in the community. He preached sermons, counseled families, worked closely with children in youth activities. And in 1975, religious authority often went unquestioned. If a pastor offered guidance, people listened. If a pastor joined the search for a missing child, nobody viewed it as suspicious. But investigators would later suggest Zandstra understood something deeply dangerous: trust can become camouflage. Some witnesses later recalled him appearing unusually involved in conversations surrounding the investigation. At the time, nobody questioned it. Looking back decades later, investigators described that detail as unsettling. Because criminal profilers have long noted that some offenders insert themselves into investigations to monitor suspicion and maintain control over the narrative. Meanwhile, Gretchen's family continued living inside unimaginable grief. Birthdays passed. Holidays passed. Years passed. But the questions never disappeared. Who killed Gretchen? Why had she been targeted? And could the person responsible still be living freely somewhere? As time moved forward, the case slowly grew colder. Witness memories faded. Leads dried up. Public attention disappeared. Eventually, David Zandstra moved away from Pennsylvania. And for decades, many people believed the truth might never be discovered. Until an old memory resurfaced. One hidden inside forgotten diary entries. Cold cases are often solved through forensic breakthroughs. DNA. Technology. New evidence. But sometimes, the key comes from memory. Years after Gretchen Harrington's murder, investigators received information from a former friend of David Zandstra's daughter. The woman had known the family decades earlier. And while revisiting old belongings, she remembered disturbing diary entries she had written as a teenager. The entries described strange interactions involving Zandstra, moments that made her uncomfortable but never fully made sense at the time. As an adult, those memories suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Especially while thinking about Gretchen's unsolved murder. That information changed everything. Investigators reopened old files. Re-examined timelines. Reviewed witness statements. And slowly, suspicion began moving toward a man who had escaped scrutiny for nearly 48 years. David Zandstra. The respected pastor. The family friend. The man who had participated in search efforts. As investigators looked deeper into his past, disturbing patterns allegedly began emerging. And eventually, authorities decided to confront him directly. What happened next became the center of a long legal battle and public controversy. According to investigators, Zandstra made statements they interpreted as admissions. But those statements, and the evidence surrounding the case, would later be challenged in court. In 2023, investigators traveled to Georgia, where David Zandstra had been living quietly for years. Nearly 5 decades had passed since Gretchen disappeared. But for investigators and Gretchen's family, the case had never truly ended. Authorities confronted Zandstra with inconsistencies. Old witness information. Timeline details. And memories resurfacing from the past. Then investigators referenced the diary entries. According to investigators, the atmosphere inside the room changed. For nearly 48 years, Gretchen's family had lived without answers. Now investigators were sitting across from a man they believed may have been connected to one of Pennsylvania's most haunting cold cases. Authorities later stated that Zandstra made statements they interpreted as admissions connected to the 1975 disappearance. However, the case did not end there. He was arrested and charged in connection with Gretchen Harrington's death. And in January 2025, after a full trial, a jury found David Zandstra not guilty. The verdict left the case in a complicated place. Because investigators stood by their interpretation of events, but the legal system did not reach the same conclusion. Every Sunday, families placed their children inside church classrooms believing they were safe. That trust is what made Gretchen Harrington's case so psychologically devastating decades later. Communities rely on assumptions. Parents assume schools are safe. Churches are safe. Trusted adults are safe. Predators operating inside respected institutions understand something powerful: people are far less likely to suspect someone they emotionally trust. That trust can become protection. Historically, institutions connected to authority and morality have often struggled to confront accusations involving respected leaders. Not always because evidence is absent, but because the emotional resistance to believing the truth can feel overwhelming. In Gretchen's case, investigators suggested Zandstra's role within the church community may have helped shield him from suspicion for decades. Nobody wanted to imagine that a pastor could be capable of such violence. But history repeatedly shows that outward appearances often reveal very little. Some offenders build entire identities around trustworthiness. They volunteer, smile warmly, offer guidance, blend seamlessly into ordinary life. And that duality is what makes cases like this so deeply unsettling. Because sometimes danger does not look dangerous. Sometimes it looks kind, helpful, religious, respectable. There is something uniquely haunting about cold cases involving children. Time moves forward. Communities change. People grow older. But unresolved tragedies remain frozen in place. For nearly 5 decades, Gretchen Harrington existed in that painful space between memory and mystery. An 8-year-old girl whose life ended before it had truly begun. A family forced to live without answers. And a case that moved through investigation, accusation, and ultimately a trial that ended without a conviction. But some cases refuse to die. Investigators continue revisiting old evidence. Witnesses remember details they once dismissed. Families continue asking questions. And sometimes, decades later, the truth still resurfaces in fragments. A forgotten memory. Old diary entries. Lingering uncertainty. Those fragments became the thread that unraveled a 48-year story. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all remains: no matter how carefully the truth is buried, the past has a way of resurfacing. On the morning of August 15, 1975, Gretchen Harrington left home carrying a Bible and began walking toward church. Her family believed she was heading toward safety. Instead, investigators say she crossed paths with the one man the community never feared. A trusted pastor. A man who stood beside grieving parents, helped search for a missing child, and was later accused of involvement in one of Pennsylvania's most debated cold cases. In the end, the case was not resolved with absolute certainty. It moved through investigation, accusation, and trial, ending in a not guilty verdict. But even after the courtroom closed, the questions did not fully disappear. Old diary entries. Lingering suspicions. Conflicting interpretations of the same story. And after decades of silence, the past still echoes. Revealing how fragile certainty can be, when trust is placed in the wrong hands. If you want more cold cases, interrogations, and true crime documentaries like this, subscribe. And let me know which case we should investigate next.